The debate hall was packed with people eager to hear Ben Shapiro speak about religious values in modern society. Today, we're discussing the historical and cultural importance of Jesus Christ as a foundational figure in Western civilization. Shapiro began his voice confident and measured, regardless of one's faith. The Judeo-Christian values derived from biblical teachings have shaped our moral framework and societal structures. The young boy raised his hand, suddenly interrupting Shapiro's flow. "Yes, we'll have questions at the end," Shapiro said, preparing to continue. Elon Musk stood up. "My son has something to say that might be relevant to your discussion," the crowd murmured as they recognized who was speaking. Even Shapiro paused, recognizing the distinctive figure. "This is highly irregular," said the moderator, "but given who you are, perhaps we can make an exception." Elon nodded appreciatively and guided his son toward a secondary microphone set up for audience questions. "My name is X," the boy said clearly into the microphone, his voice remarkably articulate for a 5-year-old. "I have a question about your premise, Shapiro." Ever the debater nodded with interest. "Go ahead, young man. You said Jesus' teachings are the foundation of Western morality. But weren't these ethical principles already established in multiple civilizations before Jesus?" Shapiro smiled, thinking this would be simple. While ethical frameworks existed in other civilizations, the specific moral architecture that underpins Western democracy and individual rights derives from the Judeo-Christian tradition. X didn't hesitate, but didn't the Greeks establish democratic principles centuries before, and didn't philosophers like Confucius and Buddha teach similar moral concepts? Without the theological framework, the audience shifted in their seats. Shapiro hadn't expected such a pointed question from a child. "That's a fair point about democracy," Shapiro conceded, but the specific emphasis on individual dignity and worth comes primarily from biblical concepts. The idea that humans are created in God's image gives us intrinsic value, but ancient Egypt had concepts of individual judgment and moral accountability. X replied, and Hammurabi's code predates biblical law by centuries. Shapiro adjusted his approach. "You're surprisingly well-informed for someone so young. However, the amalgamation of these principles within a coherent theological framework is what makes the Judeo-Christian tradition distinctive." X tilted his head. "Isn't that circular reasoning you're saying? It's distinctive because it combines things in a distinctive way." The audience gasped. Shapiro, known for his debate skills, found himself rethinking his strategy. "Let me clarify." Shapiro said the specific combination of moral principles, the emphasis on both justice and mercy, and the framework for understanding human dignity form a unique contribution, but that still doesn't prove. It's the foundation. X. Persisted correlation doesn't equal causation. Just because Western civilization developed alongside these religious traditions doesn't mean one caused the other. Shapiro watched the child with growing respect. "You're making good points. Perhaps we should explore this further. Would you like to continue this discussion?" The moderator, sensing opportunity, quickly arranged for the unexpected debate. The audience buzzed with excitement as chairs were brought to the stage. No one had anticipated that today's event would feature Ben Shapiro debating a 5-year-old, and that the child was holding his own as X settled into the chair across from Shapiro. The moderator adjusted the format to accommodate this unusual turn of events. Shapiro ever. The professional regained his composure and decided to engage the child seriously. "Let's focus on the historical. Jesus, Shapiro, began. The evidence for his existence is substantial, with references from Josephus Tacitus and other contemporary sources. His impact on history is undeniable, regardless of one's theological position." X nodded thoughtfully. "I agree, Jesus likely existed as a historical figure, but the claims about him vary widely. The Gospels themselves don't agree on many details. How do we separate the historical person from the theological construct?" Shapiro nodded. Impressed? That's a sophisticated question. The historical consensus, even among secular scholars, is that Jesus was a Jewish teacher who gathered followers and was executed by Roman authorities. The theological interpretations came later, but that's exactly my point. X said, his small legs swinging beneath his chair. If we're discussing Jesus' impact, we need to distinguish between the historical teacher and the religious figure constructed over centuries of theological development. Shapiro leaned forward, the two aren't entirely separable. Even the earliest accounts show Jesus making exceptional claims about his identity and purpose. But those accounts were written decades after his death, excounted the earliest gospel. Mark was written around 70 CE, almost 40 years. After the crucifixion, how reliable can these accounts be with such a time gap? The audience watched in amazement as the debate deepened. Shapiro, recognizing the child's unusual knowledge, adjusted his approach. Oral traditions were remarkably reliable. In ancient context, Shapiro explained, the disciples and early followers had strong incentives to preserve Jesus' teachings accurately. They faced persecution and death for these beliefs. People die for false beliefs all the time. X replied, Heaven's Gate members died for their beliefs that doesn't make them true. Sincerity isn't evidence of accuracy. Shapiro nodded. That's a fair point about martyrdom not proving truth. However, the early Christians weren't just dying for beliefs they accepted. Secondhand, the apostles were claiming to have witnessed events firsthand. There's a difference between dying for something you believe and dying for something you claim to have seen. But we don't have their direct accounts. X said, we have accounts written by unknown authors claiming to represent what they saw that's hearsay. Evidence. The moderator, fascinated by the exchange, checked his watch. We've been at this for 10 minutes already. Should we move to another topic? X smiled. I'd like to explore the moral teachings themselves. If Jesus' value is in his moral framework, let's examine what's truly unique about it. Shapiro agreed. An excellent suggestion. Let's discuss the ethical contributions of Jesus' teachings. The crowd had grown silent, entirely captivated by the unexpected intellectual jewel unfolding before them. Many were filming on their phones, knowing they were witnessing something extraordinary. X's father sat quietly in the front row, now his expression a mixture of pride and amusement, as his son engaged one of the most formidable debaters in America. One of Jesus' most profound contributions, Shapiro began, was his emphasis on internal motivation rather than external compliance in the Sermon on the Mount. He taught that anger is equivalent to murder and lust to adultery. This internalization of morality was revolutionary. X nodded respectfully. That's an important point, but wasn't this concept already present in Jewish thought? Psalm 51 says, "Create in me a clean heart." And didn't Buddha teach that desire is the root of suffering centuries earlier? Good observation, Shapiro acknowledged. Jesus was building upon Jewish foundations certainly, but his systematic emphasis on intention over action represented a significant development. His teachings about loving enemies and praying for persecutors went beyond conventional morality. The Tao Te taught something similar around 400 BCE. X replied, and various Indian traditions emphasized nonviolence and universal compassion before Jesus. Shapiro adjusted his approach. What makes Jesus' teaching distinctive isn't just the content, but the grounding he connected moral behavior to God's character and kingdom, providing both motivation and framework, but that assumes divine authority. X counted. If we're discussing Jesus as a moral teacher rather than a deity, then his teachings must stand on their rational merits, not appeals to authority. The audience sat transfixed as the 5-year-old articulated concepts many adults struggled to grasp. Shapiro nodded. Let's examine those merits. Then Jesus' ethical system balances justice and mercy in a unique way. His parable of the Good Samaritan broke down tribal boundaries while maintaining moral responsibility. That's valuable, X agreed, but Stoics like Epictetus taught universal human brotherhood around the same time, and Jewish rabbis were debating similar concepts about loving neighbors across boundaries. Fair point, Shapiro conceded, but Jesus consolidated these ideas into a coherent framework accessible to common people. Not just philosophical elites, I think that's true. X said, making complex ethics understandable is valuable, but that makes Jesus a great communicator of existing ideas, not necessarily the originator of a new moral framework. Shapiro looked thoughtful. Perhaps that's underselling his contribution. The specific combination of moral principles delivered with such clarity and power represents a unique contribution. I think that's closer to the truth. X replied, Jesus was a remarkably effective moral teacher who synthesized and communicated ethical concepts beautifully, but attributing Western civilization's moral foundation exclusively to him overlooks the complex intellectual heritage that preceded and followed him. The debate continued with Shapiro clearly adjusting his claims in response to the child's insights. The audience watched in amazement as the poised 5-year-old consistently brought the conversation back to evidence and logical reasoning. X's father observed silently, occasionally making notes on his phone. The moderator checked his watch again. They were 15 minutes into what was becoming a legendary exchange. Shapiro decided to shift the focus. Let's discuss faith and reason. Jesus' teachings, while accessible to reason, also invoke faith. The relationship between these two modes of knowing is central to understanding his impact. X nodded. That's an important distinction. Faith involves trust in something beyond empirical verification. Reason requires evidence and logical consistency. How do you see these relating to Jesus' teachings? Jesus didn't present faith and reason as opposing forces. Shapiro explained he offered evidence through miracles while also emphasizing trust. The balance between these elements has profoundly influenced Western thought, but the miracle accounts come from the same texts whose reliability we already questioned. X noted, and many religious traditions claim miracles. What makes Jesus' reported miracles more credible than others? Shapiro adjusted his approach. The historical evidence for Jesus' resurrection, for instance, is substantial enough that many initially skeptical scholars have found it compelling the transformation of the disciples, the empty tomb accounts, and the early church's growth, despite persecution. All point to something extraordinary. Those are interesting points, X acknowledged, but they're all consistent with alternative explanations too. Disciples could have been mistaken or created a narrative. They came to believe religious movements often grow under persecution. Islam and Mormonism. Both expanded despite opposition. The audience was captivated by the young boy's reasoned responses. Many who had come expecting Shapiro's usual rhetorical dominance were witnessing something entirely different. Let's approach this differently. Shapiro suggested Jesus' teachings about faith weren't blind acceptance, but relational trust. He invited people to test his words through lived experience. That's a more reasonable approach. X agreed pragmatic testing of ideas makes sense. But doesn't that mean Jesus' ideas should be evaluated based on their practical results rather than claims of divine authority? Yes and no. Shapiro replied, Jesus himself pointed to his works as evidence of his authority. He didn't demand blind faith, but faith grounded in observable reality. But that raises another question. X continued. If we judge religious claims by their practical outcomes, many belief systems produce positive results for their adherents. How do we distinguish between them without circular reasoning? Shapiro nodded appreciatively. That's precisely why the historical claims of Christianity matter. If the resurrection occurred, it validates Jesus' authority in a way other religious claims lack. But that returns us to historical evidence. X pointed out, and historical evidence is probabilistic. Not certain at best. We can say some explanations are more likely than others, not that they're proven exactly. Shapiro agreed, and that's why faith remains part of the equation. Not blind faith, but reasonable faith. Based on the best explanation of the available evidence, the moderator checked his watch again. They'd been debating for nearly 18 minutes. What had begun as an unusual interruption had become an intellectual exchange that no one wanted to end. X's father continued watching quietly, occasionally nodding at particularly insightful points from his son. Let's explore Jesus' cultural impact. Shapiro suggested, regardless of theological positions, his influence on art, literature, law, and social structures is undeniable. X nodded. I agree his cultural impact is enormous. Western art, literature, and music are filled with Christian themes and imagery. Even our calendar divides history around his birth precisely. Shapiro continued, from Michelangelo's Sion Chapel to Bar St. Matthew Passion, from Dante's Divine Comedy to Dostoevsky's novels. Jesus' life and teachings have inspired countless masterpieces. That's true. X acknowledged, but cultural influence doesn't necessarily validate theological claims. Greek mythology inspired tremendous art too, but we don't consider Zeus historically accurate. Shapiro smiled fair point, but Jesus' impact goes beyond artistic inspiration. Concepts like human dignity, equality before God, and concern for the marginalized have shaped Western social structures in profound ways. I think that's partially true. X replied, but those concepts evolved significantly over centuries. The same Christianity that preached equality before God also justified slavery, colonialism, and various forms of oppression. The relationship between Jesus' teachings and their cultural implementation is complex. The audience nodded, impressed by the child's nuanced understanding of history. You're right about the complexity. Shapiro agreed human institutions often fail to live up to the ideals they profess, but the ideals themselves, the moral vision Jesus articulated, repeatedly served as a basis for reform movements from abolition to civil rights. That's a good point. X said, his teachings have been both misused and used to correct those misuses, but that suggests their interpretation is highly subjective. How do we determine which interpretation is correct? Textual context and historical understanding help, Shapiro explained. While interpretations vary, careful study reveals central themes that have consistently shaped Western moral development, but those interpretations change over time. X pointed out modern Christians often emphasize Jesus' compassion and inclusion, while earlier generations focused more on judgment and separation. Both cite the same text that reflects changing cultural contexts, Shapiro acknowledged, but the core principles, love of God and neighbor care for the vulnerable, the intrinsic worth of human beings, have remained influential across historical periods. I agree those principles matter. X said, but attributing them solely to Jesus oversimplifies their development. Humanitarian values have emerged in various cultures through different philosophical and religious traditions. Shapiro nodded. That's true. The question isn't whether Jesus invented all moral concepts, but whether his particular synthesis and expression of them has been uniquely influential in Western development. That's a more reasonable claim. X replied, his influence is undeniable, even if his originality might be overstated. The debate had reached a remarkable depth of mutual understanding. What began as a challenge had transformed into a sophisticated dialogue that had the audience completely engaged. The moderator glanced at his watch. They had been talking for exactly 20 minutes. Let's consider why Jesus remains significant to billions of people. Today, Shapiro suggested beyond historical influence, what explains his enduring personal impact? X considered the question, I think Jesus represents different things to different people. To some, he's a divine savior, to others, a moral teacher or prophet, to still others, a revolutionary figure who challenged oppressive systems. All true, Shapiro agreed, but underlying these interpretations is something more fundamental. Jesus addresses universal human experiences, suffering, guilt, purpose, mortality. His story offers meaning in the face of life's most challenging questions. That's an important insight. X acknowledged. Regardless of historical debates, Jesus' narrative provides a framework for understanding human experience. It offers hope in suffering, forgiveness for wrongdoing, and purpose beyond material success. The audience listened intently as the debate shifted from intellectual analysis to deeper existential questions. Even as an Orthodox Jew who doesn't share Christian theological beliefs, Shapiro continued, I recognize Jesus' profound impact on the human search for meaning. His life and teachings speak to our deepest longings and fears. I think that's true. X said thoughtfully, stories that endure typically address fundamental human needs. Jesus' narrative of sacrifice, redemption, and transformation resonates across cultural boundaries. Exactly. Shapiro nodded, and this helps explain his continued relevance even in increasingly secular societies. The questions he addressed, what constitutes a good life? How we should treat others, what happens after death remains central to human experience. But other traditions address these questions too. X pointed out, Buddhism offers insights about suffering, Confucianism about social harmony, humanism about finding meaning without supernatural elements. You're right. Shapiro acknowledged. What makes Jesus distinctive isn't that he alone addresses these questions, but the particular answers he provides, answers that billions have found compelling across cultures and centuries. X nodded. I think that's fair. His enduring significance doesn't require claiming he's the only source of wisdom, just that his wisdom has proven remarkably adaptable and meaningful across diverse contexts. The audience sat transfixed by the maturity of the exchange. What had begun as a challenge had evolved into a nuanced exploration of religious and philosophical ideas. A father checked his watch. The moderator noticed and announced, "We've now been at this for exactly 20 minutes. Should we conclude, or would you like to continue?" Shapiro looked at the child with genuine respect. "I'd like to hear X's final thoughts." If he has any, straightened in his chair, his expression thoughtful. Beyond his years, I think our conversation shows something important. We can disagree about Jesus' divine nature, historical significance, or moral originality while still learning from each other. Well said, Shapiro agreed. The quality of our discourse matters as much as our conclusions. What I've tried to show, X continued, is that absolute claims about Jesus' uniqueness or foundational importance often overlooked the complex interplay of cultural influences throughout history. The audience nodded, many filming this remarkable conclusion at the same time. X added, dismissing Jesus' significance would be equally mistaken. His impact on human thought and culture is undeniable, even if we interpret it differently. Shapiro nodded appreciatively. That's a balanced perspective. Jesus' importance doesn't require diminishing other traditions or claiming he invented all moral. His distinctive contribution lies in how he synthesized, embodied, and communicated profound truths in ways that continue to resonate. I agree, X said, and I think the best approach is neither uncritical acceptance nor dismissal, but thoughtful engagement with his teachings on their merits. That's precisely the kind of reasoned discourse our society needs. More of, Shapiro replied, examining ideas based on evidence and reasoning rather than predetermined conclusions. The moderator stepped forward. I think we've witnessed something remarkable today, a conversation that deepened understanding rather than hardening divisions. X smiled. That's what good debate should do. Help us see more clearly, even if we don't end up agreeing completely. His father stood and approached the stage. I think that's a good place to end. Thank you, Mr. Shapiro, for engaging so respectfully with my son. Shapiro extended his hand first to X, then to his father. The pleasure was mine. I've rarely had such a stimulating exchange. As they left the stage, the audience erupted in applause. What had begun as an ordinary lecture had transformed into an extraordinary dialogue that would soon circulate widely online. Later, as they drove home, X-Feather glanced at his son in the rearview mirror. "You did well today? What made you want to challenge him?" X looked up from the book he was reading. "I thought it would be interesting to see if his ideas could stand up to questioning. The best ideas get stronger." When challenged, his father nodded. "That's true. And what did you learn from the exchange?" X considered the question that good conversations aren't about winning or destroying someone's view. They're about understanding more clearly. Mr. Shapiro adjusted his claims when he saw weaknesses in them. That's what honest thinkers do. As they continued driving, social media was already exploding with clips of the debate headlines were forming prodigy child challenges. Ben Shapiro on religious history and remarkable exchange between Shapiro and 5-year-old philosopher, but neither X nor his father were checking their phones. They were discussing what they might have for dinner. The conversation with Shapiro already fading into the background of their day. Just another interesting exchange in lives filled with curiosity and learning.